Are you ready for me? Okay. Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Okay. Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. All right. Very good. Thank you. The microphone was perfect. I totally readjusted it this morning. I redid the whole thing. So, okay, that's good to know. All right. Are you here to teach this class? No? Okay. All right. Can you see this? Can you see this okay in the camera? Okay. Did Glenn make it upstairs with you guys? Did Glenn make it upstairs with you guys? All right. I wonder if his mother knows that. Okay. Are we here? How will we know, right? I have no idea. Yeah, I should have advertised this more, because I know there were a whole bunch of people last year that did the first 5 classes, and then we never did it because of COVID. So, or the year, I can't remember how that came down, but for some reason it didn't happen. So there were a bunch of people that never did class 6. So anyway, here we are. All right. Class 5 was a long time ago, wasn't it? So, but does anybody have anything lingering from class 5 or any of that you want to talk about? I don't know how anybody could even remember that long ago, but okay, good. Are you okay with me not having a jacket on and exposing my wire and everything here? So, sorry. So, okay. You can see how the sausage is made, all that stuff. All right. All right, we need a microphone. Here we have a microphone here. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, the microphone's on, so that's good. Okay, move where you're not sitting in the air conditioning is good. Yep, I get that. Yep, don't do that. Of course, if you go all the way over, then you get all the hot air, so. And there's a lot of hot air from up here, too, so I don't know. All right. So what I thought I'd do is start with the separation between the Western and the Eastern Christian church, because the Eastern church always gets the short shrift whenever we talk about all this, and they have in the first 5 weeks. So I just want to take us back to class 1, where we did early church history, and remember the Nicene Creed and all of the Jesus controversy stuff, and how we were going to be a monotheistic church with 3 understandings of God and all of that fun stuff. So, it was the Eastern church that came up with the main solution to that, the homoousios conversation, and we're not going to get back into all that. But they, obviously the Eastern and Western church saw things very differently from the very, very earliest days of the church. And as most of you know who do the history stuff, the official split between the Western church and the Eastern church was in 1054. And we do use that as one of the 500-year marks in the church where something major happened. And that is the official split. But as I talked about in the early class, in that first class, there was a very different theological take from the very, very earliest times. And the thing that I want to mostly bring back to your attention is original sin. Because the difference in how the Eastern and Western church understands original sin is just gigantic. And as we talked about then, we actually fall in that theology much closer to the Eastern church than we do the Western church. But that whole understanding in the West that original sin was a sin that historical figures made, and because of that we had this stain on our soul and we had to get rid of it, as opposed to the Eastern church, who understood original sin as the sin that we all commit. And their story is the first 4 stories in the Bible, saying that's what we're being told at the beginning of Genesis: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the flood story, and the Tower of Babel. That we always screw up and we always make these mistakes, and that's original sin, the general sin of humanity. So that's some of the major difference. So on the Eastern side, of course, we have the entire Orthodox tradition And all of these, the Syrian tradition, the Ethiopian church is Eastern, the Indian church, Egyptian, Coptic, you can read the list. So that's kind of Eastern, the Eastern church. And the Western church, you have a much better idea, but I wanted to put it in lines for you to help. So think about from the Reformation in the West, we had Rome, and then came, first was the Lutheran split, and then was the Calvinistic one, and which is very much tied with the Anabaptist tradition, and then the Anglican tradition, separate from these, because this didn't happen until later, probably like 1530 something, if you want to put a date on it. So out of the Anglican tradition, believe it or not, came the Baptist tradition in the 17th century. And out of the Anabaptist tradition came the Mennonites, the Amish, the Society of Friends, the Quakers. All of those folks came out of the Anabaptist tradition, okay? So the other major tradition here is Calvinism, of course, from the Reformation, and that's where the Presbyterian Church came from. Okay, you're not going to find a whole lot of Presbyterians on one side of the Presbyterian fence who will even talk about that today, but that's the case. Paul. Sorry. Thank you, Leo. Also, Anabaptist Church of the Brethren. If you ever heard of the Church of the Brethren, which is real big back east, that's also in that Mennonite line. Okay.
Yeah, Steve. Is this on? Yeah. Another, as I understand it, major difference that matters between Eastern and Western. I'm taking this partly from John Dominic Crossan's book, Resurrecting Easter, where he and his wife and the Borgs traveled to Europe and West Asia quite a bit for a decade, right, and looked at the artwork in churches, and came to the conclusion that over the period, say 500 to 1,000 or something, Western Christianity basically adopted a kind of an individual salvation or
yes,
individual resurrection viewpoint, whereas the Eastern Church
yes,
held to universal salvation, universal resurrection. Everyone is saved, and it's intolerable to think of somebody not being saved.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little oversimplified, but it is absolutely true that in the Reformation, the Western Church turned much more towards individual salvation, certainly than the Eastern Church did. And remember that also the Eastern Church is the church of the icons, and that's what the West was battling all that time. So that's a major difference too. There's much more mystery in the Eastern tradition than there is in the West. We try to explain everything in the West, and the East, they're just fine with saying it's a mystery. Let's just leave it that way. And there's some really good things that have come out of that. But you're absolutely right that individual salvation became, after the Reformation, a much bigger part of the Western tradition. And some of us are trying to fight that today. So, yep. Okay. Good. Karen?
Yeah, with the Eastern Church, then, what have they been like in terms of social justice, that part of the of gospel?
Yeah,
caring for the poor, let's say, the preference for the poor and all that?
Because the Eastern Church never bought into this individual salvation thing like the West did, they always had a grander understanding of that. But there was never a real social gospel in the Eastern Church at all. So that whole movement never really happened in the East. Just like there was never a Reformation. So that's the other thing that affects the Eastern Church as opposed to the Western Church. There was no Reformation. So a lot of the theology in the Eastern Church is really, really ancient. It goes back to Basil and all of those guys from the early church. And that much hasn't changed. So in some ways, the Eastern Church seems archaic to us. So they never had that kind of movement, but on the other hand, they didn't have to because they never started worrying about people individually as opposed to this communion of saints. I hope that's helpful. They never had to go through that kind of movement, and there's good things about that and bad things about that. So, okay, all right. So on the Western side, where do I start? Gosh. So you see the main breaks here. And then the other major thing that happened only in America. And that was this 19th century explosion of denominations in America that did not happen in the rest of the world. So in that 19th century split, and all those new churches, we had the Mormon tradition, we had the Christian Science tradition, almost opposite ends of the fence there. We had Jehovah Witnesses. We had all those eschatological churches that came about in the 19th century in America. The Assembly of God tradition. All of that was broke away. Seventh-day Adventists, that would be another big one. So Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, LDS now, Jehovah Witnesses, and that whole eschatological movement. All of that started only in America in the 19th century, okay? And then the other main thing that I want you to hear now is this whole this whole process of fundamentalism in the church came about as a lashback to the study of the Bible and the time and evolution, all of that stuff that happened in the 19th century. Fundamentalism was a lashback to all that, to say, we're not going to believe in any of that stuff because the Bible is literally true. And that movement is also very much an American movement, and that did not begin until 1905 at I'm going to term it with the Azusa Street Revival in 1905, which was the beginning of this lashback against all this study of the Bible. Because before that, nobody questioned any of that stuff. And that's when this entire movement started out of fundamentalism. Now, I know fundamentalists don't use that term anymore, but I'm using it because it was their term. It was based on a pamphlet that was written called The Five Fundamentals, and that's where it came from. So today that's a pejorative term, but that's where it came from. So. Is that one on too?
Does that work?
Okay,
Okay.
go.
So I'm confused.
Closer.
I would have thought that the Puritans, who, it seems to me, they were the fundamentalists of the Anglican Church?
Well, they weren't in the Anglican Church, but yes, I
Okay,
know what
so
you mean, yes.
I would have considered
Yep.
them to be fundamentalists, as well as some of the other groups that came here for religious freedom. Is that different than what you're talking about in this movement from
Yep.
1905?
That was a wholly different movement, and it was about something very different. Leo, did you want to?
Yes, can a connection be drawn between these early 19th century, between these early church developments in America, between them and the labor movement, early capitalism,
Yep.
and the Industrial Revolution?
Yep, yeah, very much all tied in together, very, very much so. But the Puritan movement that happened in England was a lashback against the Anglican tradition and the via media road of that. So we might see it as a closed-minded approach, but it was not fundamentalist in the way they understood the Bible. The biblical, there was no such thing as biblical literalism when they existed, because everybody read the Bible the same way. They just took on a much stricter way to understand things, but it was not fundamental in the way they approached the Bible. It was not the way we separate literalism and another understanding of the Bible. That didn't exist at the time. So they were certainly stringent, but their theology was not fundamental. Okay, they did not need to believe those 5 things to be okay. So the other thing that happens in the 19th century with all these other new churches that have come about is, of course, what Leo just brought up, the Civil War, too. So here we have the Civil War, and we have all these congregations who are clamoring on both sides of the Civil War issue. And that is where the major split came in all of the denominations in America. So at the time, we had Presbyterians, we had Methodists. So I didn't say, the Methodist tradition came out of the Anglican tradition. John and Charles Wesley were Anglicans, and they stayed Anglicans the whole time. But their movement of having a more emotional approach to religion became the Methodist tradition. Okay, so Lutherans, the Congregationalists, so what is now the UCC Church, the Episcopal Church, the Disciples of Christ, the American Baptist. I'm getting ahead of myself. The Baptist tradition. All of those Protestant traditions split in half in the Civil War, okay? Except for one. So the Presbyterians broke into what is now the PCA Church and the USA Church. The Methodists split into a southern branch, and I'm not remembering what the name of that was now, and then the United Methodist branch. The Lutherans is what is now the ELCA, and all the Synod Lutheran churches. Everybody, all of those churches split in half, except the Episcopal Church. We stayed together during the Civil War, for better or for worse. And you can make your own decisions about whether that was good. Of course, the Baptist tradition became the American Baptist and the Southern Baptist. So all of those names that you know today, those separations, all of those happened in the Civil War. So now we've got a whole bunch of churches that have fallen into either this category or what we used to call mainline churches, which is all the churches that did not, that stayed on the northern side during the Civil War, okay? So you see that split. So today, it is much more important for most people to not be concerned so much about the denomination as to whether they're on this side or this side of the fence. And that's the major difference in our churches today. Karen and then Paul.
So I know you talked about this before, but how did the Episcopal Church stay together during the Civil War?
How did they?
Yeah, how did they manage to stay together? Because obviously
They stayed
They're-
together by not taking a stand
not taking a stand.
against slavery. That's how they stayed together. And I'm embarrassed to say. So that's how we stayed together. We just didn't take a stand. And that didn't come until much, much later. Paul.
Is it correct to call the churches that are called evangelical fundamentalist, or is
Yeah.
there a difference there as well?
So, when fundamentalism happened, all of those churches called themselves that in that line. And let me add that the Azusa Street revival was very much a revival of the heart. So all of the Pentecostal kind of churches were in that tradition too, when all of this started. So like Assemblies of God, Nazarene, all of those came in there. So at some point, and this was really late, I mean, maybe even the early 90s, fundamentalism became a pejorative term because it got thrown in with fundamentalism in any other religious tradition, and the folks there didn't want to use that word anymore, so they took the word evangelical and replaced it. So yes, it's pretty much a straight line of the two. They just changed the terminology for their own churches. Okay, so the Presbyterian PCA, I can't remember the other part of the Methodist tradition, the Synod Lutheran churches, the Assembly of Gods, the Nazarenes, the Church of God in Christ, all of those got put into that one camp. And the Disciples of Christ, the American Baptists, even the Roman Catholics, the ELCA Lutherans, United Methodists, all got put in the mainline camp. And that's the major difference to this day. Somebody usually brings up at this point Scientology. Scientology is not a religion, it's a philosophy. So I can't put it in any of these categories. It's a very different thing. Anyway, so let me talk about some of these individual churches, and then we can add into that wherever you want to go, okay? So one of those churches in the 19th century breakaway was the Disciples of Christ, which was a very ecumenical movement, and the basic suggestion was that all Christian doctrine should be reduced to, do you accept Jesus or not? And it was meant to be a way to gather all of the churches together, but now the Disciples of Christ have their own doctrine, and that theology is very similar to ours here, as well as many other churches on that main line group. I have lots of Disciples of Christ friends, and we have trouble finding stuff to argue about. So it's pretty close, okay? Seventh-day Adventists on the other side of the fence on this 19th century break. That was a very eschatological movement. It was all about the end times. Their original prediction was that the world was going to end on October 22nd, 1844, but that got revised as they went on. Seventh-day Adventists are known for moving the Sabbath back to Saturday, which I think is probably an accurate thing to do. They're known for their dietary laws, no tobacco, tea, and coffee, but Seventh-day Adventism is all about eschatological stuff, the world ending, and when that's going to happen and what that looks like, okay? Another group during that time was the Christian Scientists, as we talk about, Mary Baker Eddy. Christian Scientists today are very much in the same theological camp as we are, and Disciples of Christ and the ELCA Lutheran Church, etc. But you all know about their view about medicine, and that happened when Mary Baker Eddy was instantly cured when she was near death after reading a certain passage in the Gospel. You all know about their Science and Health publication. But they have a very pantheistic view of the world, that everything is part of God. In that way, they're very much similar to my own personal theology. And I will tell you that when I was in my last parish up in Page, I got beat up all the time by all the pastors on this side of the fence in town, which was virtually everybody else. And it was always the Christian Scientists and the Unitarian Universalists who came to save me all of those times. So Unitarian Universalist movement happened much later, and Unitarians are not Christian in that sense. They believe in Jesus as a prophet, but from other theological standpoints, they also have a lot of similarities to us. Okay? So those 5 fundamentals, does anybody know the 5 fundamentals that created the fundamentalist movement? So this is probably important for you to know. It is that you believe fully in the miracles of Jesus, that you believe that that the birth of Jesus was a virgin birth, okay? In substitutionary atonement, just as I've described it in church, that because that Jesus had to shed blood and die for us to have a chance to go to heaven or to reach any sort of salvation. The bodily resurrection of Jesus, that Easter was an event where Jesus' body physically disappeared, and in the inerrancy of Scripture, that Scripture is always right, no matter what. Those are the 5 fundamentals, and that's what separates us most from those groups. Okay? Do you want me to keep going down denominations, or should we? Do you have any questions, specific questions about denominations? Jehovah Witnesses are also very eschatological, another one of those 19th century groups. It's named for Isaiah 43, verse 10, and that refers to Yahweh. Jehovah is actually a taking of the vowels from one name for God and the consonants from another and putting them together. It actually doesn't exist, but that's where the word came from. Charles Taze Russell was the guy who started the Jehovah Witness movement in 1872. He was a Congregationalist, but he really thought we needed more fire and brimstone in what we were doing. So he takes this much more apocalyptic approach, that Christ is coming. He said that the Armageddon was happening in 1914, and he got that from Luke chapter 21, verse 24. And of course, you know that that didn't happen. The Jehovah Witnesses are the ones that use that famous 144,000 number, that there are only 144,000 people from the book of Revelation that are going to be beamed up, and that everybody else will live for 1,000 years. I don't want to get into all the millennialist stuff. But that whole process, the Watchtower Society, all of that comes from the Jehovah Witness movement. Paul, and then Karen.
Maybe you'll come to this later, perhaps, but in the 19th and much of the 20th century, these churches were existing in a milieu of numerous Christian sects. From, I don't know, 1940, 50, 60 on, we now live in a milieu that has many other sects from many other parts of the world.
Yep.
Anything you want to say about that?
So I'm only getting every
Not
other
Christian
word you're saying.
sects, but
So
others.
say that one more time, because I'm only getting every other word you're saying.
Okay, I'm saying that since the mid-20th century,
Okay.
many denominational or non-denominational traditions, not specifically Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, etc., have
Right.
come from other parts of the world and largely created a presence in the United States. So
Yep.
the milieu of religion is very different.
Absolutely. So yeah, so that may take us into the next topic. Yeah, so as the world shrunk and people started hearing the theology of other traditions from all over the world, of all world religions, it really affected the way we understand everything. And it changed our whole approach to religion in many ways. So as we started to learn from one another, we expanded our own theologies and how we approach the world. So I mean, let's just take the Dalai Lama as an example. I met the Dalai Lama in like early 1980s. I don't remember exactly what it was. And what he was saying, all these people started converting to Buddhism during that time because of how they were understanding Buddhism as compared to Christianity. And he was saying the exact opposite. He kept saying, I don't want you to change your religions. You're not understanding what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there is goodness and truth in all of us and in all of our traditions. And if I had been here, I might have been another religion. So he was giving us this universal understanding of religion, and a lot of people weren't getting that. That universalism has really affected how all of us understand religion and how religions have come together. And it's really influenced every religion to the point where, and I want to talk today about where we're going as a church, and that is the greatest influence on that now, is that we have the opportunity now to understand all world religions in a way that we never did before. Houston Smith, I keep forgetting I can take this down now. Houston Smith was the first person that I knew who really started comparing religions one by one to each other. And it really helped all of us see a much bigger picture of God and a much bigger way of understanding things. Now, there are a lot of people who say things like, all religions are basically the same. We all believe in God. I totally disagree with that. All religions are very different, and they have very different concepts and understanding of God. but we can learn so much from each other because of what other people have experienced and how they've experienced God and how that affects us. So for example, Muslims understand God as the holy other, this being that is so complex and so complicated and so wonderful that we can't really understand what that God is like. The holy other is a great way to understand one of the concepts in Islam. And that concept is very foreign to us when we have a God who we understand as intimate and with us and very personal to us. So our theologies are very, very different. But what Muslims have taught me is that there is a part of God that is the holy other, that I can't ever understand, that none of us will ever understand. And it's really helped me see God in a much bigger light than I would have otherwise. So that's how my Muslim friends have helped me increase my understanding of God. And I think that happens to all of us in all of our religions. The more that we learn from each other, the more that we can see how another concept is totally different from ours, but is helpful to us in seeing a bigger picture. So does that mean that we will get to the point where we will all merge into one? I don't think so. I don't think we're going to ever be to that place. And we can see some of that happening in the Christian church now. Is that where you wanted me to go, Paul?
I mean, I have to say that this notion of everything coalescing into one really freaks me out.
Yeah,
I mean, this
me
is
too.
this is the Lord of the Rings and this desire to
Yeah.
to gain control of everything.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. And I can't imagine that happening. I can't even imagine that happening within the Christian church. So here's the great example. So we are now in a concordat with the ELCA Lutheran Church, meaning that our that clergy can serve in each other's congregations, and that we are in general agreement about our own theologies, and that we are the same in that way. But so a couple years ago, some of you know that we had a Lutheran clergy person here at Grace St. Paul's, Kimberly Law. She came up out of the Lutheran tradition, and she served here at Grace St. Paul's because we can do that yet. But you know what? Go talk to an ELCA Lutheran and an Episcopalian and try to get them to agree on everything and sit in the same church. It's really hard. Now, we've got a half a dozen Episcopal Lutheran churches in Arizona and Utah and around the West, and we're getting along. But you know how most of those churches do it? One Sunday they do the Lutheran service, and the next Sunday they do the Episcopal service, because nobody wants to let go of their tradition and how they do that. So I don't think we're going to ever be anywhere near that, and I don't think that's a helpful thing either.
Right, and I'm not saying that I expect that to happen. I'm just saying there are people who argue that it should.
Right.
And that scares me, that we should all agree on everything.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Karen, are we so far away from whatever you were going to say that we need to?
Well, maybe, but,
Okay.
so this is like way back. But I'm interested in how do in the hierarchies of the Western Church, and maybe in particular the Episcopal and Anglican Church, have any interaction with or discussion with or conversation with the higher up hierarchies of the Eastern Orthodox Church? Is there any communication going on?
Sure. Yeah. So I think we've talked about the fact that the Episcopal Church has been on the front line of the ecumenical movement since the 1920s. The Disciples of Christ were another big factor in trying to bring people together. And we regularly have discussions with each other about various things. The patriarchs in the Orthodox tradition, and more recently, Pope Francis has done that. That was not happening so much before him, but that's happened. And our presiding bishops have regularly met with patriarchs and other folks, and we have a fair amount in common. But you talk about different ways to do liturgy. Any of you who have been in an Orthodox church know that it is really, really ancient, and they've held on to a liturgy from the 2nd century. I mean, we're using the same sort of Eucharistic prayers, and we do all that the same. But, the Orthodox Church, those folks are still standing for the whole service. This sitting down stuff, there's no way that's going to happen. So it's practical things, too, like that. But, yeah, we talk regularly. Yep.
Well, that's interesting. And so another question would be, is there communication? Are there any public communications, actually, between the Episcopalian churches and Buddhists, for example, or Hindus?
Yeah, we have regular interface sessions with all kinds of people. Yep.
So these interfaith things,
Yep.
they don't seem very accessible to people like me, regular lay people.
Well, I thought you were talking about from a leadership.
Well, I was, but
standpoint,
now I'm asking about this other thing.
All I can say is keep your eyes and ears out there because there are regular events happening that we have with various groups. So we do that fairly often. Yep. So Debbie. Yep. Let's get you a microphone. Oh, you have a microphone.
Where does the Oxford movement fit in with all of this?
Okay, great. Okay. So the question was, where's the Oxford movement in this? So it's not over here at all. No Oxford movement ever happened here because there was nothing to ever change because they kept all their vestments and everything in the Eastern Church. In the Western Church, the Oxford movement is specifically about us because in the early Episcopal Church, soon after we broke away from the Church of England, broke away meaning that we wrote our own prayer book, the church that came to America was very low church, so vestments and candles and things like that weren't in most Episcopal churches at that time, and they didn't come back until the Oxford movement in the 19th century, which was a move to recover much more of that early of the early liturgical stuff in church. So, yeah, it was strictly within our tradition.
What happened to the Oxford movement? They just kind of phased out? They just kind of, I don't...
No, so the Oxford
Are they
movement
still around?
was very influential in the Episcopal Church. Joyce, could you see if you can help those folks see what they need? Or somebody back there, please. Thank you. The Oxford movement was really influential. The only reason that I wear vestments is because of the Oxford movement. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had any of that stuff. And now the church is diverse enough that you will find folks on every end of that, from very Anglo-Catholic churches, which were very influenced by the Oxford movement, to folks that weren't so much. And that movement is a visual thing. It's not about theology or how we understand things. It's not that we're more Catholic. It's just the way we do liturgy. So our most Anglo-Catholic churches, so for example, in this diocese, St. Michael's, St. Andrew's, St. Philip's now are very Anglo-Catholic churches. They very much follow the same liturgical patterns as in the Roman tradition. As in the Roman tradition from a while ago, they're much more liturgical in that fashion than most Roman Catholic churches that you go to today. They held on to that. And then there are churches kind of in the middle of that, like us. And then there are churches that are still pretty snake belly low, where nobody would ever call me anything but Mr. And this would be way, way too far out there. So that's typical Anglicanism. We have churches all the way across the board in all of those directions. Yep. It's all part of the whole Episcopal experience. Yep. Karen?
Yeah, so I'm interested about the Oxford movement too, because I do know that some of the early members of the 12-step recovery in AA were members or practiced, and that somehow it was involved or got involved with the beginning of the 12 steps.
So, are you saying like Samuel Shoemaker was big in the Oxford movement? Somebody like that? I didn't even know that, if that's the case.
I thought so.
Okay, that's very popular.
I don't know, but I do know that they practiced, some of them, in the early movement.
So AA was formed by an Episcopal priest. I guess most of you know that. And basically what he did was he took the God language out of our liturgy and created the 12-step program and moved on from that. So when AA folks say that AA is their religion, I always find that really cool, because it is basically the Episcopal Church with God taken out of the language. So that's where it came from. I didn't know who in that founding group was part of the Oxford movement. I didn't even know. Bill Wilson was? Okay. You can, yeah, go ahead.
He actually got sober first in Oxford movement.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know.
And he started pulling drunks off bar stools and bringing them in to the Oxford movement
How
meetings.
interesting.
And having them give testimony about how they saw the light, kind of
Right.
thing. And the Oxford movement kind of split with him and said, we don't really want this kind of thing happening here. So, just if you could just move on.
Right.
And so the story goes from there about how AA was then founded. And they did use, when they started discussing the steps, they did use the foundational experience that Bill Wilson had with the Oxford movement. And
How
they started off
interesting.
with, I think, 3 steps, and then they stretched it out to 6 steps, and then eventually 12.
Thank you. I didn't know that. That's very cool. Joyce?
I happened to Google types of Methodist church, and there's a whole list of, free, the free church and all that.
Right.
But the two that came up were the African Episcopal, and the other one that's the African Episcopal Zion Church.
Right.
So isn't that some sort of new issue with the African Americans and in our Episcopal convocation or whatever you call that?
So the African Methodist Episcopal Church came out of the early African Americans in the Episcopal Church, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, who, and this goes back to the 18th century. This is the very beginning of the country. So St. George's was the church, the Methodist Episcopal church that pulled blacks off their knees while they were praying, and that's when that split happened. Most wanted to affiliate with the Protestant Episcopal Church, and Richard Allen took a small group away from that to remain Methodists, and that group mixed together to create the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Gary is going to give us more.
We need to clarify there's a difference between the Oxford movement and the Oxford group.
The Oxford what?
Group,
Group.
which is the founding of Lutheran ministers that founded the AA movement here, where the Oxford movement is out of Oxford, England. There is a difference between those two groups.
Okay, thank
those
you.
two names. Just wanted to clarify that.
An Oxford group, and what is?
I just Googled it to get clarification on
Okay,
it.
Okay. Okay, very good.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Very good. So yeah, all of those traditions get mixed together, Joyce, but the African Methodist Episcopal group came out of an Episcopal church, and one leader took a group of them, and that became the Methodist tradition. So that's where that started from. I want to, before we leave, I want to go wherever you want to go here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about this whole emergent church thing, and where we are as a church, and where we may or may not be going. Is that a conversation you guys want to have?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So most of you know that we've talked a little bit about the fact that I certainly personally believe that we're in a reformational movement in the church right now, and that the church of today, even the church of today, looks different than it did even 10 years ago, and I think that's a good thing. There are a lot of people really wringing their hands about the state of the church today, and that the church is disappearing. You've seen all the numbers from Pew Research and everybody else that the Christian church is dying off as a whole, and that it won't exist in some period in the relatively soon future. I am not in that camp at all. I think that we're in a reformational movement, and that the church is going to look very different in the next 30 years from what it did so previously, but I don't think we're dying at all. There's, let me take I don't know if I want to, let me take a step back. So some of the movements that have come out of this have been referred to as an emergent movement and an emerging movement. And Diana Butler Bass did a really nice study of what was going on there. in a book called Christianity for the Rest of Us. And she did a social analysis of what was going on in churches, and she looked, when she did that book, she specifically looked at 10 congregations in America and how they were different from other churches. And she wrote up 10 signposts to recognize these churches. And all of these churches were vibrant and growing. All of them were using a theology that was very close to what we're doing here at Grace St. Paul's. All of them were very involved in social justice issues. All of them were very involved in healing ministries of some sort or another, and a number of other signposts. And so in the mid-1990s, mid to late 1990s, Bishop Carolyn Irish in Utah asked me to go to this conference at the National Cathedral about this movement, this whatever this thing was that people were trying to define. So I hadn't read Diana's book. I got on the airplane and said, you got to get this finished by the time you get to the cathedral. And I'm reading this book, and she is describing the parish that we were doing, that we had at St. David's in Page. I mean, I'm reading this and I said, what? There's another church doing this stuff that we're doing? And you all know about it because we're doing it all here at Grace St. Paul's. And I had no idea. I thought we were like the only church in the world doing this stuff. So I got there and I said to Diana, I had no idea there were other churches doing this, and she said neither did I until I wrote this book. And she took the churches, and so I showed her the stuff, and she said, I wish I had known about you because my parents live in Scottsdale and we could have just done the whole thing. But she described what we were doing and in this social analysis of what was going on. And all these churches were doing great. And then the diocese sent me to an Episcopal church conference in New Orleans where they brought together 40 priests in charge of congregations who were all in churches that were growing exponentially. And they put us all in the same room and said, what are you all doing? And we did the same thing, and we got the same list of all the stuff that we were doing that was making us grow. So those words emerging and emergent were used at that National Cathedral Conference a lot. And we came to define emergent as churches that were creating a new denomination, that were creating a new way to do church in a way that was different from everybody else. So it was an entire new denomination. They were trying to do something totally new. And that was what was called the Emergent Tradition. And those folks that's still happening. But then there was this other movement called the Emerging Movement, and that meant that it was happening within each of these denominations, and we were just making all of these changes. So in that terminology, what we're doing at Grace St. Paul's is very much in that emerging movement and in all of those changes that are taking about. And I got to tell you, the emergent movement, what people found out is just what we talked about earlier. As they tried to create liturgies that didn't exist already and do something entirely new, everyone would fall back on the ancient tradition eventually and pull from it. And what the emergent churches that I know of that were doing this, they started taking turns like everybody else. So one week they would do a service that came from Methodist roots, and another week they would do a Disciples of Christ service, and then they would do an Anabaptist service, and they would try to put it all together. So I don't know what that means, other than, there's a lot of discussion about whether we're in this post-denominational age, and denominations are going to go away, and we're going to... From what I've seen of this emergent church movement, I don't think that's the case. I think we're going to stay in our denominational ways, and we're just going to create something way brand new. Paul?
Well, tell me if I'm right about this. It seems to me that one thing these churches may have in common is the relationship with the state or the relationship with the culture. That is, what's dead or dying or long since dead is not Christianity, but Christendom. The
Right.
notion that everything is part of this church, and that it's an imperial church, it's a Constantinian church, and so on. And hopefully, in my mind, there is no desire amongst the emerging churches for that to be the case, for us to live in a so-called Christian society. There's
Right.
all kinds of stuff wrong with that, and all kinds of compromises to the Christian message. I mean, as I understand early Christianity, being a Christian was a very difficult thing to do. It wasn't something that everybody was born into and could do. And that, I don't know if that's what we're returning to or not, but this idea of discipleship is a very difficult path for people to follow. The culture as a whole is not very likely to want to do that.
Yep.
So these churches, well, I mean, it's dangerous for them to want to conform or to want to be appreciated and approved of by the culture at large. On
Right.
the other hand, that's who we and they serve.
Yep, I think you're onto something there. And I think this is the key to all of this. So some of you know that I constantly go back to Constantine and what happened to the church when we became the Church of Rome, when we became the Church of the world. I would suggest that we let go of many of our ideals at that time to fit under the structure of the Roman Empire, and we have certainly done that here in America and across Europe throughout the Middle Ages, et cetera, et cetera. I personally think that the real Christian church, the church as Jesus imagined it, as I understand it, can only exist if we are separated from the state, if we are not controlled by the state in any way, and that we are a voice to hold the state's feet to the fire. And if we're going to be that, we can't be the largest church in the world where everybody is. We're the opposite of that. We're the underdogs. We're the people that made the biggest difference in the world by changing things from the bottom up in this grassroots movement. And I personally think that if we're going to save that church, we need to stop talking about numbers and stop talking about ways that we fit into the culture and go back to the countercultural church that grew all of this to begin with. So I am not terribly concerned about us losing numbers in that kind of fashion. I think we need to get back the church that was the countercultural church that created all this to start with. Now, there are ways to live in the culture and do that too, but that's why I'm not terribly concerned with us being the same church we were in the 1950s. Leo?
I figure this is a good time to ask my big question.
Okay.
So, as you've previously noted, our government framers were the same men who framed the Episcopal Church's polity.
Right.
James Madison unabashedly stated that the government's checks and balances ought to be so constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. I'm quoting. This was about maintaining a political aristocracy of a certain, quote, order of men. In my experience, it seems that there exists a parallel opulent minority in the Episcopal Church in the sense of formal sanctioned education that creates a power and influence differential.
Gotcha.
3/4 of our governing body is clergy. Essentially, when attending seminary is financially unattainable for the majority, doesn't that bolster the power structures of the opulent minority against drastic change that the majority may will and functions as a kind of gatekeeping? So what, if anything, is the church doing to empower the majority, the laity, the economically and educationally humble to actualize equity in spiritual leadership and governance?
Dang, Leo, why did you have to put your finger right on the pulse of the whole thing? Yeah, that is a major issue in the church right now. And it's because of what Paul was saying and what I was trying to answer. So yeah, I think your timing's exactly right. How do we be that church? How do we be that church of the underdog, the church of the grassroots, and be this church, this Episcopal church that became part of the elite in society? And are we fostering that by continuing to allow only people that can afford it to go to seminary and be our priests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Those are really important questions, and how we're solving that is different across America and across the whole Episcopal Church. We're seeing this better now because the Episcopal Church includes churches in Mexico now and Honduras and these places. And we're hearing them talking about colonialism and how they were treated as a result of this. So it's much more in the forefront now than it was before. And I think we're hearing all of those things differently. So let me give you a personal example. There is no way in God's green earth that I could have afforded to go to seminary. I would be paying it back for the rest of my life. I would be. I had the gigantic advantage of beginning my process in the Diocese of Utah. And the Diocese of Utah happens to have some money from the sale of St. Mark's Hospital years ago. They paid for my seminary. And that allowed me, this blue-collar kid who could not have done this otherwise, to do this. And because of that, you are hearing a very different voice here than you would be hearing otherwise in the church. And the church is realizing that now, and they know we have to figure out ways to do this. This is especially important in minority cultures. My personal experience has been with Native Americans. So how do we create a way for Native Americans to go to seminary, or how do we create a new way to do seminary that brings up leaders from our Native American cultures, from our Hispanic cultures, from everything else? How do we stop being such a white church? That's the other thing that's happening here. And we're doing that different ways. With Native Americans, we've changed the way we're doing seminary. And it's beginning to show some fruition here. We're getting more Native Americans through seminary now in different ways, and the same thing's happening in Latino cultures, and it's happening more and more. But it's a big issue, and we need more ways to solve that issue. Seminary is now there are lots of ways to do seminary. You don't have to go away to go to seminary anymore, and that's helping with this too. But formation is really important in this process too, and hearing everybody's voice. So we don't have all the answers, but I think we're starting to get there. And I think we're beginning to create a place where lots of different people can be serving us. Paul.
And I think you're starting to touch on it, but the question is not just who goes to seminary, but what happens there. And, you know, in the mid-'60s, I went to Lily White College in the middle of Iowa that was just beginning to admit African-American students in substantial numbers. By the time I was a senior, there was a recognition that what they were doing was expecting those people to essentially become white. You know, there was no change other than these people were being admitted. No African-American history, no African-American literature, nothing like that. And it exploded, as it did in many other places. So what's going on in seminary? Are we getting third world theologians? Are we getting third world theology? Or, you know, Native American, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I want you all to talk to Paul Impey, okay, who's at seminary at CDSP now. But he showed me his course schedule for this semester and last semester, and I went, oh my gosh. So we are certainly doing that. There's much more third world stuff happening, especially at CDSP because we're getting people from the Pacific Reef, and that's making a difference too. But yeah, our classes are definitely changing and opening up more in that direction. No question about it. Yeah, Leo?
Sort of along the same lines, I've heard that part of the ordination process involves taking a psychological test.
Yes.
Does this examination act as a profile of suitability for the priesthood? And can you speak to what qualities are desirable in clergy? And if there is a trend in the church away from a vocational calling and towards merely a professional career?
Okay. So come back to that last part, but the beginning part, is that me?
Nope. No, it wasn't you.
Is that another mic? Okay. Say the beginning part again.
Does the examination act as a sort of profile?
Okay, the psychological part.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not supposed to. It was never supposed to. What the psychological exams were supposed to do was find people who may be dealing with their own stuff, who are not in a position to be leading a group of people. It was to weed out people who needed to deal with their own stuff first before they could be priests. So no, it was never supposed to be you need to have this psychological pattern to be in. And I think it's hard work, but I think we're doing okay with this. Father Gary, you may have a different take on that than me, but I think we're doing okay with that part of this. The kind of psychological stuff we do is at the beginning of the process to make sure that it's not somebody who's going to hurt people, and at the end of the process to see how crazy this whole process made us when we went through it. And I think they both play an important role, but the most important thing is that we have people that are stable enough that they're going to be able to hurt other people. They're not going to be able to hurt other people. And I think we're okay at that. Tell me the last part, and then Jeff.
There was a middle part, I guess. What are qualities that are desirable in clergy?
Yeah, so that's really changed too. We have commissions on ministry in each diocese, and in the past, I believe that as a church, we have mostly been looking for, don't take this pejoratively, we've been looking for monks. We've been looking for people that had great spiritual, inward everything, and that they had really wonderful individual spiritual lives. The problem is that most people that have that kind of interior spiritual dwelling are introverts. They go into themselves all the time. And I think we spent a long time in this church picking a bunch of introverts to be priests, and then we were wondering why we couldn't grow the church and why we couldn't connect with anybody. I think that was a major issue. I think I might be a little off on this, but just in the last 10 years that started to change.
And then the last part, do you see a trend away from a vocational calling and towards merely like a professional career for a priest, like their motivation?
There is no other way to be a priest than as a vocational calling that is part of your inner soul. And I don't think we've ever been off base on that. That is incredibly important in this process. Nobody can do this job if they don't feel called by God to do this. And that's what the discernment process was always supposed to be about. Have you actually been called by God to do this? Can you hear this voice from somebody other than God? And can we hear this voice for you? And I think we're pretty good at that. Jeff?
Yes, Sandy asks regarding the seminary at home, whether those courses are on Zoom, and if so, if registration is somewhat open.
Yes, there are plenty of courses on Zoom now, and I know that CDSP has a whole list of classes that are available on Zoom and that are available to lots of folks. I'm sure other seminaries have them now too. Yep. I was at the very early cutting edge of going to be the group of people who were going to do part of seminary at home and online. This was 1996, so it was the very early days of this process, and they had a good system in place then, and it's only gotten better. You don't want to hear that story, though. I'll tell you that some other time.
So we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm just wondering who exactly decides what is taught at seminary and who is deciding who gets to go to seminary?
Boy, these are really good questions. As far as what's taught there's a board of examining chaplains, and they come together to try to figure out what's taught in seminary and what their people are going to be tested on when they're coming out of seminary. Those are called general ordination exams, and it's supposed to be this overall thing for everything that you've gone through in seminary. Sometimes I don't think they mix very well, but that's how it's supposed to happen. And the second, who decides who's going? So that happens individually in each diocese, and there's a commission on ministry in each diocese. So when a person feels like they might be called to the ministry, they go to their local parish priest and talk about it. Then a local group is set up for that person to discern with locally in the parish. And then if that group feels comfortable that the person should move on, then they go to a commissional ministry at the diocesan level, and then the bishop and the commissional ministry need to agree that that's going to happen. That's generally how it works. Tess?
I just thought of something. My question is, does the Episcopalian Church, does it have like all of the offices that the Catholic Church has except for the Pope? Like, for example, since the Catholic Church has cardinals as well as the bishops and deacons, and I know the Episcopal has bishops and deacons, does the Episcopal Church also have nuns and monasteries?
Good questions. How do we go all this way through and not do that? So we have the same order of clergy, deacons, priests, and bishops, okay? No cardinals or anything like that. It's just deacons, priests, and bishops, and we have a presiding bishop who runs it. We do have orders of nuns and others who live in together or separately. And for example, Chris Ledyard was in the Society of St. Francis. So in addition to being a deacon, he was a brother in that tradition. And we have individual convents for folks that want to serve as nuns. That is dying a lot in the church because women, of course, can be any area in the clergy they want to be. So there's not as many people moving in those directions, but we still have some. Yep.
I'm more familiar with the issue of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, but I'm wondering about it in the Episcopal Church, and not only sexual abuse, but also if there might be any other criminal activity by someone who has been ordained or clergy or anything like that. How
Okay,
that
did
gets
you all
handled?
hear that? So the question is mostly about sexual abuse in the church and other activity that's wrong. So this is a long subject, but let me quickly say that the difference between the Roman Catholic approach to clergy sexually abusing and in the Episcopal Church is confidentiality. In the Roman Church, they have had this tradition of keeping clergy abuse quiet and secret and passing someone on to the next level. The most important thing in the Episcopal tradition is that it is reported immediately and it becomes public immediately. So that's the biggest difference in approach. Of course, we have abuse problems in the church just like anybody does, but the difference is how we approach it and how that's handled. And the person is immediately taken out of a situation where they can be with clergy people until the case is resolved. In our canons, Title IV addresses all of those issues, and we have rules about clergy behavior in lots and lots of different areas. If anybody questions any of that, it goes to a commission at the diocesan level and to the bishop, and then there is a process for them to go through to see whether they can be exonerated or not. But the biggest difference is we must make it public immediately. Okay.
Are you saying it all gets handled internally?
Am I saying what?
That any claim or allegation gets handled internally and never goes outside of, in other words,
No,
to law authority?
No, it
to
has
legal
to go
authority?
outside.
Okay.
It has to go outside the church. So it must be reported to an agency as opposed to just the church. Okay, absolute, positive. Okay, most important. I told you how that gets us in tricky water. Like if somebody comes to me and confesses something that's abusive, I'm mandated to report that, but that goes against confidentiality of the confessional, and that's where it gets tricky. But we have to tell officials outside the church, absolutely. Paul, we got 4 minutes.
All right, here's a question that'll just take 30 seconds, but there are, in my mind, two fundamentally different ways to conceive of church. That is, church can be a place that is a refuge for people from the outside world.
Yes.
Or church can be a place that assists us to find ways to serve the world.
Yes.
They're not necessarily incompatible with each other.
Yes.
But I'm wondering how you see those visions, which of them predominating, where are we going to?
Okay, thank you. I think we have been a church of the former for many, many years, that we have been an insular thing from the world around us. And certainly that is not the case here at Grace St. Paul's, and I think that's one of the major changes that is happening in the emerging church now, that we are becoming much more a church of the world and a church in the world, as opposed to being insulated from the world. And certainly, personally, that's extremely important to me, that that's the church that we become. If we are not a springboard to go out into the world and do it, then I don't even think we're the church. So, okay. Good.
I have a few more questions, so I'll try and make it quick. What I really want to do is just like maybe hammer out or just chisel down the differences between the Catholic and the Episcopal churches.
Okay.
In the Catholic Church, are gays allowed to become priests? Like, can the ordained priests also be gay, or they have to be straight?
Absolutely. No. Yeah, somebody's sexuality has nothing to do with whether they can be a priest or not.
Okay.
Yep.
One other question
We have
is...
plenty of gay priests in the church.
Huh?
We have plenty of gay priests in the church.
Okay. So my other question is for the Episcopal Church. Can you say how long it's been since women were allowed to be ordained as priests as well as deacons?
Officially 1976, but it actually happened in 1974.
Would that be around the same time that gays were allowed to be ordained as priests or deacons?
That happened later.
Okay.
Yeah, that's happened just in the last 10 years.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. Good? Anything else? Thank you all. Thank you. Great questions. Great questions. Thank you all very, very much. So I appreciate it. I don't think there's anybody on this group who's talking about baptism. Alice got baptized last year when we did this. Yep. But if you are, please come to me to talk about that. The bishop's visit here is next year on this Sunday, April 30th. If you are interested in the only confirmation happening in the diocese is happening at the cathedral, and I can tell you about that if you're interested. Okay. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you very, very much. Yep. Thank you, Debbie. Right. So, wow.